He wasn't born a god. He became one through fire and blood. In the ancient world, empires rose and fell like tides, but one man's ambition carved a legacy that time itself could not erode. This is the story of Alexander the Great. But before the legend, there was a boy, a prince born in 356 BC in the rugged kingdom of Macedon. His birth was shrouded in myth. On the very night he was born, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. Plutarch, the great historian, wrote that the seers of the time cried out that this day had brought forth a great calamity and destroyer for all of Asia. It was a dark omen, or perhaps a prophecy. His mother, the fiery Epirate princess Olympias, claimed his true father was not King Philip but the god Zeus himself, who visited her in the form of a serpent. Whether divine or mortal, one thing was certain: this child was destined for no ordinary life. Macedon at the time was seen by its southern Greek neighbors like Athens and Sparta as a semi-barbaric backwater. But Alexander's father, Philip II, was changing that. He was a brilliant, ruthless, and visionary king. He had inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse and transformed it into the dominant military power of Greece. He reformed the Macedonian army, creating the legendary phalanx, a wall of soldiers armed with the sarissa, an 18-foot-long spear that could outreach any opponent. Philip's ambition was vast: to unite the fractured Greek city-states by force if necessary, and lead them in a glorious war of revenge against the mighty Persian Empire. Philip knew that a conqueror needed more than just a strong arm. He needed a sharp mind, so he sought out the greatest intellect of the age to tutor his son, Aristotle. For 3 years in the quiet groves of Mieza, the philosopher taught the young prince everything from politics and ethics to medicine and natural sciences. Aristotle instilled in Alexander a deep love for Greek culture, especially the epic poems of Homer. Alexander slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, and he saw himself as a new Achilles, the ultimate warrior hero, destined for glory even if it meant a short life. This education forged a mind that was as formidable as any army. But Alexander's education wasn't confined to books. At just 16, while his father was away on campaign, a Thracian tribe rebelled. Philip had left Alexander as regent, a test of his young son's abilities. Alexander didn't just suppress the revolt, he led the army himself, crushed the tribe, captured their stronghold, and founded a new city there, which he named Alexandroupolis, the city of Alexander. It was his first taste of command, his first taste of glory, and he was hungry for more. 2 years later, at the decisive Battle of Chaeronea, the fate of Greece hung in the balance. Philip faced a combined army of Athens and Thebes. The battle was fierce, and at a critical moment, a gap opened in the Greek lines. Philip held the main force steady, but it was the 18-year-old Alexander, commanding the elite companion cavalry on the left wing, who seized the opportunity. He charged with blistering speed and ferocity, smashing into the flank of the elite Theban sacred band, a unit of 300 soldiers thought to be invincible. Alexander and his cavalry annihilated them. His bold maneuver broke the enemy's spirit and secured a total victory for Macedon. On that day, the young prince proved he was not just his father's son, but a military genius in his own right. Philip, watching from a distance, was said to have wept with joy, proclaiming, "My son, you must find a kingdom equal to your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." With Greece now under his heel, Philip began final preparations for his grand invasion of Persia. The stage was set for the greatest military campaign in history, but history is fickle. In 336 BC, during the wedding celebration of his own daughter, King Philip II was assassinated, struck down by one of his own bodyguards. The court was thrown into chaos. Who was behind the murder? Was it a scorned lover, disgruntled nobles, the Persian king, or perhaps even Alexander's own mother Olympias, desperate to see her son on the throne? The truth is lost to time, but the result was clear. At just 20 years old, Alexander found himself king. His crown was anything but secure. The moment news of Philip's death spread, the empire his father had built began to crumble. Tribes to the north revolted. Ambitious rivals in Macedon plotted to usurp him. And in the south, the Greek cities, led by Athens and Thebes, saw a chance to reclaim their freedom from the boy king they underestimated. They were about to learn a terrible lesson. Alexander didn't hesitate. He moved with a speed that would become his trademark. First, he marched north, deep into the Balkans, pacifying the rebellious tribes with brutal efficiency. While he was campaigning in the distant north, a rumor spread through Greece. Alexander was dead. Thebes, a city that had long chafed under Macedonian rule, immediately rose in open rebellion, expelling the Macedonian garrison. When Alexander heard the news, he did not send a messenger. He did not wait for reinforcements. He force-marched his army 240 miles south in just 2 weeks, a feat of logistics and endurance that left his enemies stunned. He appeared before the walls of Thebes, offering them a chance to surrender. The Thebans, arrogant and overconfident, refused. The punishment was swift and horrific. Alexander's army stormed the city. What followed was a massacre. Thousands were killed, and the city that had once been a titan of the Greek world was razed to the ground, its buildings demolished, its territory divided among its neighbors. The only structure left standing was the house of the poet Pindar, a sign of Alexander's respect for Greek culture, even as he made a terrifying example of those who defied him. The rest of Greece, horrified, fell silent. The rebellions were over. In less than 2 years, the young king had not only secured his father's throne, but had proven himself to be even more ruthless and decisive. He had consolidated his power through a storm of fire and blood. His kingdom was secure. His authority was absolute. The Greek states were now his unwilling allies. With all of Greece now united behind him, Alexander turned his eyes east to the colossal, sprawling Persian Empire, the richest and most powerful entity on earth. Philip's dream would now become Alexander's reality. He stood on the shores of the Hellespont, on the very edge of Asia, ready to cross into a new continent and a new destiny. He was no longer just the king of Macedon. He was the commander of a pan-Hellenic army, embarking on a quest for vengeance, for glory, and for a legacy that would echo for eternity. The rise of the conqueror was complete. The conquest of the world was about to begin. If you were captivated by this story of ambition and power, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We saw a young king rise from the ashes of his father's assassination to unite a fractured Greece. Now, with his homeland secure, Alexander turns his gaze eastward towards the colossal Persian Empire, the superpower of the ancient world. His mission? Not just revenge, but a destiny he believed was divinely ordained. How one man and one army shattered an empire in their shadow. This is the Great Conquest. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with an army of around 48,000 men, a coalition of Macedonians and Greeks. It was a bold, almost reckless move. The Persian Empire, ruled by Darius III, was vast, wealthy, and could field armies that dwarfed Alexander's. The first major test came swiftly at the Granicus River. The Persian satraps, the local governors, were confident. They positioned their cavalry right on the riverbank, a conventional but vulnerable position. Alexander, ever the aggressor, didn't hesitate. He led the charge himself, spearheading his elite companion cavalry straight across the river and up the muddy banks into the teeth of the Persian line. The fighting was ferocious. Alexander was in the thick of it, his helmet cloven by a Persian axe, his life saved only by the quick thinking of his general, Clitus the Black. But the Macedonian phalanx, that unstoppable wall of pikes, proved its worth. It systematically crushed the Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia, and the Persian line broke. The victory was total. In one swift, bloody afternoon, Alexander had unlocked the gateway to Asia Minor. He sent 300 sets of Persian armor back to Athens as a dedication, with the inscription, "Alexander, son of Philip and the Greeks, except the Lacedaemonians, from the barbarians who live in Asia." The message was clear. This was a pan-Hellenic crusade, and he was its champion. With Western Asia Minor under his control, Alexander marched south along the coast, liberating Greek cities that had been under Persian rule for generations. He was greeted not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. But Darius III was not a king to be trifled with. He was mobilizing the full might of his empire, assembling a massive army from every corner of his vast domain to crush this impudent Macedonian once and for all. The two titans were on a collision course, and their meeting would shake the foundations of the world. In November of 333 BC, near the town of Issus, the two armies finally met. Darius had chosen the ground carefully, a narrow coastal plain between the mountains and the sea, which he believed would neutralize the superior quality of Alexander's troops by preventing them from being outflanked by his superior numbers. It was a sound plan, but it failed to account for Alexander's genius for the unexpected. The Battle of Issus was a spectacle of chaos and courage. The Persian army was immense, perhaps numbering over 100,000 men. At its center, surrounded by his elite guard, the Immortals, was Darius himself, watching from his magnificent war chariot. As the battle began, the Macedonian left flank, under the command of the veteran general Parmenion, came under immense pressure. But it held. That was all Alexander needed. On the right flank, he once again led his companion cavalry in a decisive, thunderous charge. But he wasn't aiming for the Persian flank. He was aiming for the heart. He drove like a spearhead directly towards Darius. The sight of Alexander, a whirlwind of death and fury, bearing down on him was too much for the Persian king. Darius panicked. He turned his chariot and fled the battlefield, casting his army into disarray. The king's flight triggered a complete collapse. The Persian lines disintegrated, and the battle turned into a rout. The spoils of victory were staggering. Alexander captured Darius's entire camp, including his mother, his wife, and his children. In a gesture that would become legendary, Alexander treated them with the utmost respect and courtesy, assuring them of their safety and status, a stark contrast to the brutality of the age. Issus was more than a victory. It was a humiliation for the great king. An empire had not just been defeated, it had been shamed. After Issus, most of the Persian-held Levant surrendered to Alexander. But one city stood defiant: the island fortress of Tyre. A powerful maritime city-state, Tyre was considered impregnable. It sat on an island half a mile from the coast, protected by massive walls that rose directly from the sea. The Tyrians, confident in their naval superiority and fortifications, refused to submit. They had defied conquerors for centuries. They had never met a man like Alexander. He demanded their surrender, and when they refused, he decided to do the impossible. He would build a causeway, a land bridge, across the sea to the island. For 7 agonizing months, his engineers and soldiers toiled, building a massive mole of earth and timber out into the water. The Tyrians relentlessly harassed them with projectiles from their walls and surprise attacks from their ships. They even sent a fire ship, a vessel packed with combustibles, that incinerated months of work. Any other commander might have given up. Alexander simply started again, building the causeway even wider and constructing siege towers taller than any seen before. Finally, after a brutal siege that tested the limits of engineering and human endurance, his forces breached the walls. The retribution was terrible. The city was sacked, and its people were either killed or sold into slavery. The siege of Tyre stands as a testament to Alexander's unyielding determination and his terrifying capacity for both brilliance and brutality. From Tyre, Alexander marched south into Egypt. The Egyptians, who had long chafed under Persian rule, welcomed him not as a conqueror, but as a divine liberator. In a move of profound political and personal significance, he made a pilgrimage deep into the desert, to the Oracle of Siwa, a revered sanctuary dedicated to the god Amun, whom the Greeks equated with Zeus. What happened in the inner sanctum of the temple remains a mystery, but when Alexander emerged, the high priest had greeted him as the son of Amun Zeus. This divine recognition solidified his legitimacy in Egypt and fueled his own belief in his unique destiny. He was no longer just the king of Macedon, he was a living god, a pharaoh. It was here, at the mouth of the Nile, that he founded the first and greatest of his many new cities, Alexandria. He personally laid out the city's grid plan, envisioning a multicultural hub of commerce, culture, and learning. It was a city designed for the future, a testament to his vision of a blended Hellenistic world, and it would soon become the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean for centuries to come. With Egypt secured and his divinity affirmed, Alexander turned his army back towards the heart of Persia. Darius, having fled from Issus, had raised another, even larger army, and was waiting for him on the plains of Gaugamela, not far from modern-day Mosul in Iraq. This would be the final, decisive confrontation. In 331 BC, the two armies faced off. Darius had chosen a wide, open plain to give his scythed chariots and vast numbers of cavalry full advantage. He had an army that may have numbered as many as 250,000 men. Alexander, with fewer than 50,000, was vastly outnumbered. The night before the battle, his general Parmenion suggested a night attack to sow confusion. Alexander famously refused, stating, "I will not steal my victory." He would face the might of Persia in the light of day. The battle that followed was a masterclass in tactics. Alexander used an oblique formation, refusing his left flank to draw the Persian cavalry out and create a gap in their line. Just as at Issus, when the moment was right, he led a devastating cavalry charge straight for the gap, aiming directly for Darius. And just as at Issus, history repeated itself. Darius fled. His flight once again shattered the morale of his army, and the greatest imperial force the world had ever seen crumbled into dust. Gaugamela was the death blow. The Persian Empire was effectively finished. Following the victory, Alexander marched on the great cities of the empire. Babylon and Susa opened their gates and welcomed him, handing over their immense treasuries. Finally, he reached Persepolis, the magnificent ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid dynasty, a symbol of Persian power and grandeur for 2 centuries. For several months his army rested amidst its splendors. Then, in an act that has been debated by historians for millennia, Alexander ordered the great palace of Xerxes to be burned to the ground. Was it a drunken act of impulse during a wild party, as some ancient sources claim? Or was it a calculated act of political theater, a symbolic gesture of revenge for the burning of Athens by Xerxes 150 years earlier? We may never know for certain, but as the flames consumed the heart of Persian glory, they signaled the end of one era and the dawn of a new, Hellenistic age. The conquest was complete. The boy from Macedon now sat on the throne of the King of Kings. But for a man like Alexander, the end of one conquest was merely the beginning. He conquered the world, but not his own destiny. Having subdued the mighty Persian Empire, a feat that would define most men for a lifetime, Alexander looked east. For him, the world did not end at Persia. It was merely a stepping stone. His eyes were now fixed on a land of myth and legend. India. This wasn't just another campaign. It was a plunge into the unknown. The geography, the climate, the cultures, everything was alien to his Macedonian veterans. They had marched for years, crossed deserts and mountains, but the humid, dense jungles of India were a different kind of challenge. And so were its defenders. In 326 BC, at the Hydaspes River, Alexander faced his most formidable opponent yet, King Porus and his army of war elephants. These were living, breathing tanks, creatures the Macedonians had only heard of in tales. The Battle of the Hydaspes was a masterclass in tactical genius. Alexander, using the monsoon rains as cover, executed a daring flanking maneuver across the swollen river. The ensuing battle was brutal, a clash of disciplined phalanxes against raw, terrifying power. The Macedonians, though terrified, held their ground. Their long sarissas proved brutally effective against the elephants, turning the beasts into a liability for Porus's own army as they panicked and trampled his infantry. Alexander won, but the cost was immense. He was so impressed by Porus's courage that he not only spared his life but also made him an ally, granting him more territory than he had before. This victory, however, marked a turning point. Alexander wanted to push on, to march to the ends of the world at the Ganges River, but his army had finally reached its limit. Imagine it. You've been on the march for nearly a decade. You've fought in countless battles, seen friends fall, and are thousands of miles from home. Now your king, a man you once followed without question, wants to lead you even deeper into a land of torrential rains, strange diseases, and seemingly endless enemies. At the Hyphasis River, the unthinkable happened. The army mutinied, not with swords, but with a weary, stubborn refusal to go any further. They laid down their arms and begged Alexander to turn back. For the first time, the invincible conqueror was defeated, not by an enemy army, but by the exhaustion of his own men. A furious and disappointed Alexander locked himself in his tent for 3 days before finally, reluctantly, agreeing to return. The journey back was a new kind of hell. He split his forces, with one part sailing down the Indus River and another, led by himself, marching overland through the brutal Gedrosian desert. It was a catastrophic decision. Thousands perished from heat, thirst, and starvation. It was a march of death, a grim testament to Alexander's hubris. Was he punishing his army or himself? Surviving the desert, Alexander returned to Persia with a grand vision. He wasn't just a conqueror anymore. He wanted to be a unifier. He dreamt of a new world, a harmonious blend of Greek and Persian cultures. He organized the Susa weddings, a massive ceremony where he and 80 of his top officers married noble Persian women. He integrated 30,000 Persian youths into his army, teaching them the Macedonian way of war. He adopted Persian dress and court customs, like proskinesis, the act of prostrating before the king, which deeply offended his proud Macedonian companions, who saw it as an act fit for gods, not mortal kings. This fusion was radical. To his men, it felt like a betrayal. Was their king forgetting his roots? Was he becoming one of them? Tensions simmered. At Opus, another mutiny erupted when Alexander announced he was sending the veterans home. It turned into an emotional confrontation, with Alexander recounting all they had achieved together. He wept, and so did they. The bond, though strained, was reforged. But the end was approaching. In 323 BC, after returning to Babylon, the bustling heart of his new empire, tragedy struck. His closest friend, his other half, Hephaestion, died suddenly from a fever. Alexander was shattered. He plunged into a grief so profound it bordered on madness. He ordered extravagant funeral rites and demanded Hephaestion be worshipped as a divine hero. Lost in his sorrow, Alexander began planning his next great expedition, a campaign into Arabia. But it was not to be. After a prolonged bout of drinking at a banquet, Alexander fell gravely ill with a fever. For 10 days, the conqueror of the world wrestled with an unseen enemy. His generals filed past his sickbed, asking who he would leave his empire to. His legendary and perhaps final words were, "Toi kratis toi," to the strongest. On June 10th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great, king of Macedon, hegemon of Greece, pharaoh of Egypt, and king of Asia, died. He was just 32 years old. The cause of his death remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Was it malaria, typhoid fever, or was it poison? A final act of betrayal by those who feared his growing power and strange new vision. We may never know. What we do know is that chaos followed. His vast empire, held together by his singular genius and force of will, had no clear heir. His generals, the Diadochi or successors, immediately began to fight over the spoils. For the next 40 years, the world Alexander had conquered was torn apart by the wars of the Diadochi. His dream of a united Hellenistic world fractured into several rival kingdoms, like the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire in Asia. Alexander's legacy is as vast and complex as his empire. He was a brilliant military strategist, a visionary leader who sought to bridge East and West, and a ruthless conqueror whose ambition left a trail of destruction. He spread Greek language, art, and thought across the known world, kicking off the Hellenistic Age, a vibrant era of cultural exchange and scientific advancement. Cities from Egypt to Afghanistan still bear his name. Yet he was also a man consumed by his own legend, pushing himself and his men beyond the limits of human endurance. He conquered the world, but in the end, He was conquered by his own mortality. His empire was as fleeting as his life. A brilliant blazing comet that streaked across the ancient sky and then vanished, leaving a legacy that we are still debating thousands of years later.